Hello and welcome. My name is Alex, and this is a follow up video or the part 2 video on the series on points and planets in astrology. So, this is Points and Planets in Astrology part 2. Today, I want to talk about the remaining planets that I use. I'm going to talk about the outer planets, Pluto, Chiron, the nodes of the moon, those are really important points, and the black moon Lilith. So let's go ahead and talk about Uranus. So I've circled Uranus on this chart. So there is nothing particularly interesting about this chart. It's just the chart of the moment I started to work on this slide presentation. So Uranus in this chart is at 29 degrees and 41 minutes of Taurus. It is retrograde on the 15th of November 2025. Uranus went back into Taurus recently. And this actually marks the last time that Uranus is going to go into Taurus for a very long time. It spent around 7 years in Taurus. It went in there in around 2018 or 2019, something like that. And it stayed there for 7 years, and now it's on its way out. So Uranus in astrology, it can have two glyphs or two symbols, but most of the time you're going to see the symbol that's on the left hand side in the chart, right? So the one circled in red. So that glyph actually doesn't really have as much symbolism as the other glyphs of the planets because it was chosen later in time. It was chosen after Uranus was discovered by Herschel, and pretty much the glyph for it is just an H with a bar and a dot at the bottom. Uranus usually brings chaos and instability in the chart. It is known to be a lover of anarchy, of rebellion, of revolutions and revolutionaries. It can say something about misunderstood genius, people who bring sudden changes and sudden reversal events which bring sudden changes into your life. Innovations, especially technological innovations, are associated with Uranus, and depending on the sign that it is in, it will bring innovations in a certain area of life. So while Uranus was in Taurus, for example, we had a lot of Taurus is a lot. It is about material things. So food, money, material possessions, especially things that are valuable and good and people like. So food, for example, is a really important one. The moon is exalted in Taurus, and the moon, we talked in the previous video, actually has a lot to do with food and nourishment, right? And it is exalted in Taurus because Taurus takes what would be regular food and makes it really beautiful, really, really nice. It enhances the flavors, it enhances how it looks, and so on. When Uranus was in Taurus, for example, we saw instances of people coming up with lab-grown meat or genetically modified things, just new food sources, things that are valuable such as money. Cryptocurrencies, for example, really took off when Uranus was in Taurus. This is something that astrologers have been talking about. So Taurus does have something to do with money and valuables, anything that is valuable and has a value, right? And cryptocurrencies, which is a new type of currency, something revolutionary. It appeared during this period. It took off during the period that Uranus was in Taurus. And we know, about the erratic behavior of this currency. Its value just keeps fluctuating up and down. It's really difficult to follow. A lot of people didn't really trust it at the beginning, but it's gaining a lot of trust now because people think that this is here to stay. It's not going to go anywhere. So this is something that Uranus and Taurus brought. So it can bring a lot of innovations. Uranus usually shows an area where we have ideals of perfections that are usually unattainable for a normal human being. So Uranus has a very strict view of perfection and how people should behave, and anything that's too human or too natural or too too close to nature, it can easily put off Uranus. So Uranus is very sensitive with those things. It has some ideals. They're sometimes unreasonable. That's why it kind of has a reputation as a bully, because Uranian people do have a reputation to be sort of bullies if people do not meet its high expectations. What are the things that I write in my notes? So Uranus shows where we have a huge inability to keep things as they are. So you experience a lot of instability, whatever area Uranus is in. So in this chart, Uranus is in the 12th whole sign house. So the 12th house in astrology has to do with sleep, for example. So people who have Uranus in the 12th, they might have a really weird sleep pattern. Maybe, there are not 2 nights one after the other where they sleep in the same circumstances. Maybe things keep changing. Maybe they have trouble sleeping. Maybe they wake up at strange hours in the middle of the night. So it shows an area of life where you experience a lot of instability, either because it just comes to you or because you are causing it. So yeah, there's a fine line between, it being an external thing and it being something that you do. It can cause a lot of erratic behavior. When you have a transit from Uranus somewhere, it sort of changes things, and it leaves you with a feeling that things moving forward just have to change completely. For example, having Uranus going through your 10th whole sign house, it can bring some changes into your career life. It can bring maybe you want stability. So, in this chart, we have Saturn in the 10th whole sign house. So if this was the chart of a person, they want stability in their life, right? But if Uranus was going through the 10th, it would bring a lot of change and instability. So it can cause your intentions to just change completely overnight, and your direction in life changes completely when Uranus goes through a certain house, or there's something that is happening that just gives you the feeling that going forward things really have to change, or it gives you a lot of anxiety to change things. You just cannot stay still in a certain place. Sometimes wondering, but obviously I have no medical training at all, so I don't really know, but I'm wondering how much ADHD is actually related to Uranus, because it is true that with so many technological devices, with phones and iPads and things distracting you all the time, having notifications popping up all the time, having very short videos that people watch, people's attention span, it did go down. But I have a feeling that people have a Mercury Uranus connection in their chart. So if there's an aspect between Mercury and Uranus in the chart, especially if it is harsh or difficult, maybe your mind is a bit erratic, or your attention, your ability to focus on something and think about something is a little bit weak, because you are subject to a lot of change. Uranus also has a love of shocking people. So if we continue with the Mercury-Uranus contact, for example, people who have Mercury-Uranus, they really keep you on your toes when they're telling you a story or when they're talking about anything at all, because Mercury-Uranus, for example, would love to shock through words. Words and language are ruled by Mercury, which we talked in the previous video, and Mercury-Uranus together, they bring really shocking words. It has an ability to sort of electrify an audience, to wake people up. Richard Tarnas actually called Uranus the Great Awakener. You might never really be able to guess somebody's next move. Somebody, if they have a really strong Uranus in their chart, you might never really guess what they're going to do next. You might find them quite odd and weird and unpredictable, and this makes people quite nervous, because the human part of us would like things to be really stable and predictable, but there are these influences, and when we're talking about the outer planets, we're reaching the area of the solar system where planets are no longer visible with the naked eye. So there are things that are not visible really. They're still there, but they're in the realm of the invisible. They're not the physical material things they interact with easily day to day. There's something a little bit different. So there's a really important differentiation between, on one hand, the luminaries, the sun and the moon, which are the largest and the brightest in the sky, and then the visible planets, so Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, those you can see. But from Uranus onward, we reach the area with bodies that we cannot really see at all. It is true that sometimes under really good conditions and really dark skies, when Uranus is at opposition, which in this chart it is about to happen because the sun is at 23 degrees of Scorpio, and very soon the sun is going to be exactly opposite Uranus at 29 degrees of Taurus, so in about 6 days, right? Maybe a little bit earlier than that because Uranus is retrograde. But when they're going to be at opposition, it is possible under the perfect conditions to see Uranus, so it becomes a visible planet. But other than that, and most of the time it is not visible to the naked eye, you need special instruments to see it. Flashes of insight and realization are also ruled by Uranus. When you have a sudden flash of inspiration. I remember watching a documentary. I don't know if Uranus was involved at all, but I was watching a documentary by the woman who wrote Harry Potter, and she said that she was on a train when this idea of Harry Potter came in her mind, and she said that was the most pure stroke of inspiration that she ever got. And it made me think of Uranus. I don't know if I do look at her chart. I'm curious if she had any Uranus transit at that time, but the way she described her experience, having a sudden flash of insight, that is very Uranian. Usually, when you have Uranus entering a house or coming in close contact with a planet, there's a sudden change there. There's a sudden you feel really inspired to do something really new and fresh, something that's you've never thought of before, or maybe nobody ever has thought of before. It can be quite controversial and offensive because of the desire to shock, especially when Uranus is in a hard aspect with some planets. The hard aspect includes the conjunction, so if it is very close in degree to the moon, for example, or opposite it, so 180 degrees away from it, or squaring your moon, so 90 degrees away from it. Especially those hard aspects, usually they can cause people who are a little bit controversial or offensive because they have a desire to shock others. So if that does not get expressed in a useful or constructive way, it can come across as offensive or difficult. Needless to say, Uranus can show up strongly in the chart of people who are really impulsive. Uranus also has a really compulsive need for freedom, from commitments, routine, from things just being the same. It really wants freedom. It wants to do things on its own terms. It wants to be alone when it wants to be alone, and it wants to be with other people when it wants to be with other people. It is a lover of freedom. In astrology, we also associated, when I was talking about innovators and innovations before, we associate Uranus with Prometheus in Greek myth. Prometheus gave humanity fire, and he was punished for it. And that myth actually has a lot to do with how Uranus acts in a birth chart. If you look at people who have a strongly Uranian birth chart, there are things that echo that myth, especially, bringing something new to humanity, giving them something new which can be really useful, but usually they get punished for it, or they get in trouble because of it. So it does bring quite a bit of trouble. So like I said earlier, I think some mental health issues might have something to do with Uranus, maybe PTSD, really strong anxiety, OCD might have something to do with Uranus, but more the compulsiveness in it rather than the obsession. The obsession maybe is more a Plutonian thing, which we're gonna talk about a little bit later. It has a huge impulse to go against the grain. I have a friend who's very Uranian, and it's very difficult to really understand what that person likes and dislikes because they just had a tendency to go against the majority. So if we're in a group of people and everybody liked a certain thing, this Uranian person will start to bring arguments against the thing that everybody liked. So it's kind of like a contrarian. So, Uranus does like to go against the grain. It just likes to explore new things. If everybody's walking on a path, Uranus wants to explore something new and innovative in a way. And sometimes that works well, and sometimes it doesn't really work so well. I think I've said pretty much everything that I wanted to say about this. So, for people who are more spiritually inclined and they know about spiritual awakenings, I think Uranus has a lot to do with spiritual awakenings. Richard Tarnas is continuously calling Uranus the Great Awakener. So Richard Tarnas did a lot of research in astrology, and especially about cycles of planets and cycles of outer planets. And he noticed that Uranus really resonates a lot with this archetype of the awakener and with awakenings that we have in life. When you have a sudden realization, what am I doing here, for example? Why am I here in this job or in this place with these people? You have just a sudden awakening and you realize something. You realize, oh, actually I shouldn't be here. I should get out of here as soon as possible. This is not the best place for me. So in that case, that is somewhat a Uranian experience, because you just suddenly, you stand up and you go do your own thing, separate from those people that you were with before, and you don't even understand why you are there in the first place. So this is a sudden reversal and a sudden change, which I mentioned earlier. So in essence, this is pretty much what Uranus means. So we can move on to the next planet, and that is Neptune. So for Neptune, in the text on the right hand side, I didn't really put a glyph because we only have one glyph. So for Neptune, we have the trident. Neptune is the god of the seas in Greek myth. It rules in astrology. So in that chart on the left hand side is the 29 degrees of Pisces, 29 degrees and 32 minutes. So the red R, again, that shows retrograde motions, just like in Uranus's case. And Neptune rules dreams. It also has really highly idealized and romanticized views in life. It shows a life area where you have really, you see things to rose-colored glasses, as people would say. So, you maybe don't really see things as they are, but you have a really emotional and really, you kind of have a fairy tale in your head about how things are in a certain life area. Maybe you're lying to yourself a little bit. Maybe you're deceiving yourself. So it has a lot to do with the experience of a flood. The experiences that you dissolve in and disappear in. So dissolution, things that dissolve, things that are very, very sensitive. I think people who have the visible planets like the sun or the moon, especially if the moon is in a contact with Neptune, I've seen quite often that people have some psychic ability because they manage to tap into that world that is, is difficult to explain. So it is sort of very sensitive vibration that in the physical realm you could not really sense of or feel, or you cannot really get anything from there normally, but there are special configurations in the chart that give people the ability from time to time to sort of tap into that invisible world of Neptune, of ideas and dreams and images, and they can get some psychic visions, some things can come from there, very interesting and beautiful stories come from there. Usually when, like now we have a Saturn Neptune conjunction, and Saturn has a tendency to manifest things. Funny enough, kind of like the moon. Um, but it does create things, or it materializes or coagulates things from Neptune's world in this case, because Saturn is so close to Neptune. And when Saturn is close to Neptune, usually there are TV shows or movies or stories are being told, books are being written that are very beautiful, and it's a very, very beautiful and very moving story, or a prophetic story almost. So losing yourself into something or someone, so especially if if Neptune is involved with any of your relational houses, so the 7th house, the 3rd house, the 11th house, you can lose yourself in a group of people in the 11th, or you can lose yourself in a relationship, in a marriage, if it's in the 7th whole sign house. It has to do a lot with redemption and the feeling, this feeling that a lot of people have, that, oh, if I'm gonna get this one thing in life, everything is gonna be okay. So it's kind of like a salvation that you get from Neptune. And if Neptune is in the 2nd house, for example, maybe you have a dream or a fairy tale in your mind that, when I'm gonna be rich, everything is gonna be okay. When I have money, when I have this one thing, everything is gonna be okay. So you find your salvation into something. And because Neptune is going to fall into one of the 12 houses, you're going to find your salvation in one of these 12 life areas that we talk about in astrology. And, you have to think for yourself if this is something that is really possible, or if it's just a sort of sensation that you have. It might lead you there. It might be a gate into salvation, but whatever house Neptune is in, so if it's in the 2nd house, maybe money will lead you into the salvation one way or another, but the money itself is not going to be the salvation. But you have the feeling that, if I have money, then I'm going to be saved and everything is going to be okay moving forward. So the next point in my notes is massive disillusionment, because Neptune causes people to have really high hopes, a really romanticized view of the world, really high ideals, and then the reality strikes and you realize, nothing that you're imagining is actually true, and nothing is going to come of it. So there's a massive disillusionment. Being intoxicated, having a psychedelic experience has to do with Neptune. People who constantly alter their perception of reality with drugs or alcohol or anything, they're very Neptunian. And they are also maybe very sensitive people who find the world that we live in very difficult, very painful, and that's understandable. And with Neptune being so prominent in their chart, maybe they need to alter their perception of the world, because it is their character is too sensitive to handle everything that is happening. So it can be a difficult planet and a difficult thing to navigate. Being hypnotized or being in a trance, this has to do with Neptune. Sort of, if you sit on a couch and watch TV for hours and your mind pretty much stops, this is a Neptunian experience, because you're sort of lost again into something. You're in a trance where you're not really thinking anymore, but you just receive images from somewhere. So television itself was associated a lot with Neptune, actually. And losing yourself in a TV program is a very Neptunian experience, when you no longer exist as yourself, but what exists is those images that are coming from somewhere else. Basically, you're thinking somebody else's thoughts. It's not too deep of an experience, but it is an experience of a trance, of a hypnotic trance, right? Spiritual and mystical experiences have to do with this. Daydreaming, believing a wonderful fantasy and seeing it dissolve. So this is something that I've spoken of before. Ecstatic experiences. A lot of Catholic saints, I think, are talking about having ecstatic experiences. Cults. So spiritual cults, very good example of Neptune, as well as political cults. So if everybody really believes in a political party and their vision of the world and they think that's going to save them, that's a very Neptunian experience. And it almost always happens that, you know, the things that were imagined, they don't really come true. I do find this is a funny one. I wrote naive and innocent people. And naive, innocent, and gullible people, they have to do with Neptune. I think people who are strongly Neptunian can easily believe in stories and things which are not true. Mental viruses. So this is something that Eckhart Tolle talks a lot about in his talks, and I love to listen to his talks. He speaks a lot of mental viruses that take humanity over. So this is kind of in line with cults and political cults, for example. Things that were happening in Germany in the 40s. That is an example of a mental virus. People just had a vision of something that's going to save them, and in the process of achieving that vision, they committed lots of atrocities, for example. So again, you have to be very careful with Neptune because it can trick you into believing some absolutely crazy things. So it's good to have to be grounded and disciplined in a way. As I was saying before my camera overheated and stopped recording, I was talking about how Eckhart Tolle was talking about mental viruses that take over humanity, and I gave the example of what happened in Germany in the 40s. Neptune can very often show, collective dreams of redemption and salvation. And it is very important, the antidote for Neptune would be to remain grounded and remain present. And this is something that Eckhart Tolle talks very often about. If you want to successfully overcome those kind of moments, which do happen in humanity, they do happen. If you want to overcome those moments and stay, not be taken over by those collective dreams, by those collective delusions, if you don't want to be taken over by them, you have to remain present and grounded. So having people who do have a strong Neptune can keep it in under control if they have lots of planets in Earth signs, or if they have a very strong Saturn, because those tend to be more realistic and based in reality. And a lot of Neptunian dreams and things are not often based in reality. There are things happening today in some countries which are quite scary to some extent, because they show this kind of collective dream of redemption, or this collective this mental virus, this collective idea that something will save you. And because Neptune is on its way to Aries now, and Aries is all about fighting and war. There are a lot of ideas about war and fighting other people and winning, competitiveness, wanting to be better than others, as opposed to finding peace and balance. There's a lot of emphasis on independence. There's a lot of emphasis on nationalism now, and this is very much in line with Neptune moving into Aries. So you see, there's a current that is taking shape right now, but there is a way to remain grounded. Having too many beliefs and having too many opinions about things and how things should be and what is good and what is bad, having all of those, everybody does, but believing in them too much and taking them to an extreme can cause a lot of problems. So it's good to stay somewhat detached from ideas and beliefs. And another smaller things that thing that I wanted to mention about Neptune. It rules trends, and especially fashion trends. Fashion changes a lot depending on the configurations Neptune is making. When Neptune was in Pisces, we saw a lot of fashion. At the Met Gala in one year, we had priestly clothing that was fashionable, and that was the theme for that year. If you follow trends and things that people like collectively, things that everybody agrees that are nice and humanity just likes them for a period of time, these are very Neptunian things, and they don't last because Neptune keeps moving and moving around the chart. So nothing really lasts for too long with Neptune. The next point I wanted to talk about is Pluto. So Pluto does have two glyphs. It is circled there at 1 degree of Aquarius. It does have this other glyph that looks like a P, like a combination between an L and a P, because Pluto without the vowels is just PL, and we forget about the T. But the glyph that most people use, I think, is the one on the left-hand side that is on the chart itself. So Pluto is a very different kind of planet. So in astronomy, it's a dwarf planet. Pluto is very different. It is a more darker influence. It has to do with traumatic but initiatory experiences, with powerlessness and abuse of power, power struggles. Pluto loves to take things to an extreme, to make small things really big and to make big things really small. Usually in astrology, a moon in Virgo would indicate somebody who has a very good eye for detail, because the moon shows the things that you need and the things that how you react to things, and Virgo deals with lots of minute details and small little things. And a moon in Virgo usually means a lot of attention to detail. But a moon close to Pluto, for example, I think it can also give people attention to detail or attention to very small changes, because a very small change, Pluto will make it really big and noticeable. And a very big change, Pluto might make it really small and insignificant. So it kind of reverses things, and this in a way, like Uranus does reversals, but it is a reversal of mood, and Pluto does it in a terrifying way. Uranus just wants to escape and be free and go against the grain, but Pluto actually does it for very different reasons, does this reversal for very different reasons. Pluto in the chart also shows extreme denial and negation of things. So if Pluto is in a certain house in the chart, it will just deny or not give you that one thing that you really, really want. And Pluto can show something that you're really obsessed about getting and you cannot get it. So it does show obsession and things that you really want, but Pluto will very often just not give them to you, just to mess with you in a way. It has a very strong psychological component to it. People have planets in relation to Pluto. They might play mind games or psychological games. Mercury with Pluto, for example. I know somebody with a Mercury, Mars, and Pluto combination who really loves to play mind games with people by lying. And Mercury, Mars is that combination which I mentioned in the previous video as well, that is very very much known to all astrologers to have to do with lying. And Pluto just brings this psychological component to things. It has to do with intense pressure, heaviness, darkness. When you have a Pluto transit, you feel like you're under immense pressure, and it's a pressure that makes you change, sort of like it really makes me think of how carbon under immense pressure turns into a diamond. And Pluto actually has a lot to do with the depths of the earth and the riches, the things that are very, very valuable that you can find in the depths of the earth, such as like ores, like gold, or um, very expensive stones like diamonds, and the extreme pressure that carbon is under before it becomes a diamond in the depths of the earth and in the underground. That has a lot to do with how Pluto in astrology is trying to transform people. So when you have a Pluto transit, especially if it's to your ascendant or your sun or moon, you're going to be under a lot of pressure to change. And the idea is to change into something, transparent, that light shines through, and something more pure in a way, and something really valuable. It can bring about really terrifying experiences, and terror in general has a lot to do with Pluto. And it has a lot to do with really manipulative behavior, people who do anything to achieve their goals, who are really good at manipulating people, manipulating the narrative. It loves to break down other people's ego. Wherever Pluto it is, your ego might break down through that life area. If Pluto is in the seventh whole sign house, maybe relationships, marriage, maybe this is going to be what's going to break down your ego. Maybe your partner, has a tendency to humiliate you in a way, or to make you ashamed of yourself, or might laugh at you in a way that sort of messes with your mind. So it is a lot about these psychological games to make you feel small, because if you're really big, or if you act like you're really big, if your ego is quite big, Pluto will come and try to make that really small. So if you feel you're insignificant, Pluto will. If you feel you're very significant and big and whatever, Pluto will show you the opposite. He'll try to make you really insignificant, and to the idea would be to break down your ego, to break down the shell of your ego. And the more you resist it, the more suffering there is. And if you give up at some point and surrender to what's going on, everything is better. Once again, as I was saying before, my camera overheated again and it interrupted me. I was speaking about how Pluto loves to break down people's ego. So whatever life area Pluto is associated with in your chart, you're going to encounter people there that are going to try to break down your ego shell, or they're going to, or where you're going to break down other people's ego. It can work both ways, or where just life circumstances are bringing about, attempts at your ego's life. And the story of Inanna going into the underworld is very relevant when it comes to Pluto. There are other things in astrology where the story of Inanna is relevant. For example, Venus retrogrades have a lot to do with this. Chris Brennan talks about this with Dimitra George and on the Astrology podcast on YouTube. But the story of Inanna, I think, is relevant with Pluto as well, because a descent into the underworld, a dark night of the soul, is very much a Plutonian experience, I think. But it's a much longer and probably more terrifying and painful experience than the Venus retrograde. The Venus retrograde itself does not last too long, but a Pluto transit can be quite lengthy, and it really takes its time trying to break you down and reconstruct you. And the story of Inanna, who was a queen and she had to go to the underworld to meet her sister. As she went into the underworld, she had to give up on her crown and her beautiful clothes, and she had to meet Inanna naked. And being naked is an experience a lot of people are ashamed of. A lot of people are taught that, being naked and showing your naked body is something you should be ashamed of, and it should bring shame to you. So obviously, taking a queen and taking off all her symbols of power and stripping her naked to stripping her to the essence, basically, of who she really is. This is what Pluto is trying to do to people. and it is associated with some really terrible experiences. So you don't really learn who you truly are in your essence. You don't really learn about your essence of who you really are with Pluto without going through some really terrible experiences, which is why at the beginning I said it is associated with really traumatic experiences. Pluto is also associated with Hades in Greek myth, and Hades actually is known for having kidnapped Persephone, which is what brought, the lack, which is what brought winter basically. So, the lack of a harvest, the lack of the earth was just not producing anything anymore because of how mad and how upset and depressed Persephone's mother was because she was because her daughter disappeared, because Persephone was taken into the underworld by Hades. Kidnappings very often are associated with Pluto, and I've seen in some charts of people who have been kidnapped, Pluto is showing up quite prominently. This is how Persephone was taken away. Hades presented a flower in front of her that she tried to pick up, and when she tried to pick up the flower, she was taken away into the underworld. Pluto also brings experiences of great empowerment. It is true that you have all of this pressure and heaviness and darkness and depression possibly that comes with it, this really deep attempt at transformation. If it is successful, it can bring great treasures and great empowerment, because having survived these traumatic experiences can show you how strong you are, and depending how deeply you go with that experience and how deeply you realize how powerful you are in your essence, the more valuable the gift that you get from Pluto is. So I talked a lot about the underworld and Pluto. I think this is more a modern astrological association. Pluto is associated with caves. It is associated with reaches in the depth of the earth, like I said earlier, with diamonds, things that you find in the depths of the planet. Mining comes to mind, but these are very modern things. I think to some extent they are true, because the experiences, having been dragged through the underworld by Pluto, you do find some treasures in there if you manage to stand your ground around all those demons and all the influences that are in the underworld. You do find riches, and you find things which are valuable, and you can bring them out with you in some instances. So finally, we can talk about the North Node. This is a point. It is not really a physical planet, but it is a point that is very important in astrology. It's just the intersection between the orbit of the sun and the moon. And obviously the orbit of the sun and the moon intersect in 2 points, so the North Node and the South Node, they're always coming together. They're always gonna be in opposition to each other, so they're exactly 180 degrees apart, and they're both very important, very sensitive points. So the North Node of the point is also called the rising node, because from that point of intersection between the sun's orbit and the moon's orbit, the moon's orbit rises. So we have an upward motion, and for the south node, or the descending node is also called, and the north node is called the ascending node. From the south node to the north, we have the orbit of the moon is going below the sun, below the sun's orbit. So this is one of the first clues to what the North Node means actually in astrology. It is a point that is said to increase things. It is always retrograde, by the way. This is why it has the red R, right? So it is at 14 degrees and 37 minutes of Pisces, and it is retrograde. It is most of the time in retrograde motion if you look at the true node of the moon. So here we actually have another distinction. We have a true node of the moon and a mean node of the moon. So the true node is the actual position, the actual properly calculated position of the lunar node, and the mean node is averaged over time. It has a smoother and always retrograde motion. The actual node of the moon, the true node of the moon, sometimes goes direct and sometimes goes retrograde, but most of the time it is retrograde, and it goes retrograde against all of the other planets in astrology, right? So it goes from Pisces to Aries to Taurus and so on, and counterclockwise motion, and the planets go in clockwise motion around the zodiac. It is associated with hunger, materialism, the need for more. It is in increase, like we said earlier. It shows a lot of dissatisfaction very often. It shows a life area where you feel really hungry, where you always want more, and you're always dissatisfied. No matter how much you get, you might always be dissatisfied. You may have a lot of ambition in that life area. You might feel a lot of material need, but you're always gonna feel, like you haven't had enough. It's insatiable. Feeling insatiable has a lot to do with the North Node. Has to do a lot with becoming lost in the world and becoming lost in materiality. You want to manifest more, to bring more things into existence and to enjoy more things. You want to feel full, but you never really do, hence the dissatisfaction. It increases things. So if it is with Saturn, like it is here, it is said to increase the power of Saturn. So when the North Node is with a malefic planet like Saturn or Mars, we have an increasing effect. So if Saturn rules, it puts an expiration date on things. It is kind of a party pooper. It doesn't really like enjoyment. It just likes work. It likes, being productive. It's very critical. And with the North Node, we have an amplification of that. So, it kind of ramps up that energy even more. They're not very close to each other in this case. So the Saturn is at 25 degrees, the North Node is at 14 degrees. So that does matter. They're quite far away, right? So about an 11-degree orb. But the closer they get, the more the North Node has the power to amplify. And I've seen this does actually happen. I've seen, people who are famous or people who are known for something in the world, they have the North Node very close to a planet that's in line with whatever they're known for. So if the North Node is together with Saturn, with Mars, for example, sometimes maybe those people are athletes, or maybe they're dancers. Maybe they exert a lot of energy. Mars is about exerting a lot of physical energy, a lot of movement. Dancing has to do with it. Martial arts, sports, athleticism in general, and the North Node amplifies it. And it doesn't bring a sort of obsession, but it just brings a hunger for more and more and more. Obsession again is something we talked about with Pluto, but this is an amplification and a desire for more. It is a gateway into manifestation and into the visible, manifested world. It has to do with accumulating things, acceptance of more, acceptance of, if people give you just more things, you just say yes, 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 just give me more. Yeah, it is just about more things on a material level. And regarding the glyph for the North Node, it's always gonna be that that symbol that you can see there, that circle in red. This is pretty much the symbol that you see on the back of a cobra snake. It has a lot to do with snakes. Snakes usually tend to eat prey that is so much larger than their bodies, and they look completely ridiculous. They can dislocate their jaw to open their mouth so wide to eat things much bigger than they should probably eat. And this has a lot to do with the North Node of the moon. And it is called Rahu. And the reason I gave the Vedic astrological name for it is because Vedic astrology uses the North Node a lot more than Western astrology does. And they have a lot of lore and mythology about it that's very relevant. It does look like a snake. He was in the Vedic myth. It was serpent demon, but it does have to do with snakes, and this is why the symbol on the back of the cobra has been adopted as the glyph for this symbol. So we can talk now also about the south node of the moon. So this is Ketu. Ketu, for the south node, we use the same symbol as for the north node, but just upside down, because it is a reversal of everything that the north node shows. So it's really easy to sort of extrapolate the meaning of the south node if you know what the north node means. So the south node does not want materiality. It wants less materiality. It wants more spirit. It has an apathy towards materiality. It tends to withdraw from the world into spirituality, sort of like an ascetic monk. It has a little bit to do with Saturn in that sense, because Saturn also wants less, wants contraction. So there's a slight affinity between the two. And maybe this is why in the Western astrology, in the Western astrological tradition, we usually say that it's better for a malefic planet to be with the south node, because it makes it less malefic, but also they have an affinity with each other with wanting less in a way. It has a desire for feeling empty, a desire to become less, as opposed to the north node, which always wants to become more and to get more. It wants to become less. It refuses more, and it has a lot to do, for example, when people refuse food for spiritual reasons, when they're fasting, the reason that you do that, you reject the materiality, you reject food, because that enables you to sort of allows you to connect with spirit and with the presence of God, for example. Even if you don't believe in God, if you have any affinity towards spirituality, it is likely that there is something, there's a spirit, there's a presence, there's something in the world that you can associate Ketu with on a spiritual level, right? It has to do with things which are invisible, becoming less, giving things away, discarding, and it is a gateway out of manifestation. So these points, the north and the south node, they're very important because they they are the points where the eclipses happen in astrology. So right now the north node of the moon is in the middle of the sign of Pisces, the south node in the middle of the sign of Virgo. So we know when the sun and the moon are going to be next to these points, we're going to have a lunar or solar eclipse depending on the configuration, right? So a lunar and solar eclipses, they usually show great beginnings and great endings, and they show things coming into your life and things coming out of your life. And usually with the north node, things come into your life, things are manifested, and with the south node, things are going out of your life. So there's an emptiness there. On a material level, there's an emptiness, but if you're connected with a spiritual level, in that emptiness, in that empty space, there is, you get rid of the material things for the sake of reconnecting with the spiritual realm. Finally, we can talk about Chiron. So this is one of the last points that I'm going to talk about today. Chiron is a centaur. So in astronomy, people used to think when they discovered it was an asteroid, then it looked more like a comet, which kind of got trapped in an orbit that kind of looks like the orbit of an asteroid. It's not quite a planet. People used to think it is a planet, but it's not. A lot of astrologers reject it and don't want to work with it at all because they don't really see what Chiron is about. But I do tend to look at it because in my chart it's been quite important. So if in your chart it doesn't really touch any of the personal planets, so if it doesn't touch Mercury, Venus, the Moon, the Sun, Mars, and if it doesn't touch Jupiter or Saturn, even though those are less personal planets, maybe you don't really have a connection to Chiron and you don't really understand easily what it means, but I think it has a lot to do with the experience of rejection and abandonment, which is funny given that a lot of astronomers, a lot of astrologers tend to leave it out of their interpretations, especially in traditional astrology. I don't think it's being picked up very often, but I think it is important because it does speak about the experience of being rejected and abandoned. In Greek myth, Chiron is actually one of the first life experiences that Chiron had. So it is a centaur, half horse, half man being. One of the first experiences he had was to be abandoned by his mother, who she thought he looked horrible and couldn't run away fast enough from him. And she asked the gods to turn her into a linden tree so she would get rid of him. So, rejection and abandonment have a lot to do with Chiron in astrology. Exile, being an outcast, an outsider, being scapegoated by other people, just suddenly being picked as the problematic person when maybe you didn't really do anything. This happens a lot to children. So for people who have Chiron in the fourth house, parents very often scapegoat the child. So the experience of scapegoating was important in a person's childhood. Possibly it has to do with disability, paralysis, chronic illness, chronic pain, illnesses and conditions which are impossible to cure. They're always there. There's nothing you can do to improve them, but you have to accept what's going on to you. Those are the kind of experiences that Chiron governs. Things that you just cannot improve in life, no matter how hard you try. So we talked about Chiron in the fourth. Chiron in the fourth, maybe there's something about your home life, maybe there's something about your parents that you'd like to improve, but you see them as very weak and incapable and beyond any help. Maybe there's something about your home country, for example, that you see it as something that you're not very proud of, and there's nothing you can really do to change it or improve it. If it is in your 10th whole sign house, it might have something to do with your experience at work. It might have to do with scapegoating at work. Sacrifice, renunciation, and surrender have to do with Chiron. Because in the experiences that you encounter with Chiron, your only escape is pretty much acceptance. There's nothing really you can do to improve things. There's nothing really you can do to change things or the way that things are. You just have to accept them. I put a healer there because in myth and in modern astrology, Chiron is very much known as a healer, but it does not necessarily mean that Chiron has anything to do with healing particularly. It might have to do with some wounding that you suffered, and you're trying everything to sort of heal that wound, but you notice that it does not really happen, so you sort of transcend any form of healing on a material level, or you use acceptance as a form of healing. You will always have whatever wound Chiron is causing in your chart. It will always sort of be there. There's nothing really you can do to improve it or change it, but you will learn to sort of heal yourself by accepting, things as they are. And very often people who have a very strong Chiron experience, they become teachers, they become advocates for certain diseases, for example. They raise awareness about things. The suffering that Chiron brings also brings a sort of gift with it, because it helps you help other people in a way. It has a lot to do with the demand for meaning, I think, because those difficult experiences that Chiron brings, you don't really have any explanation for. You try to find what is the meaning for that, especially when people speak about children with disabilities, for example. People very often say that no child should ever experience something like this, yet the reality is that they do experience it. So, what is the meaning behind it? How can that, be allowed or possible? So there's a search for meaning and a demand for meaning that comes with Chiron. It is associated often with the loss of the will to live, and I've seen this very often, especially when Chiron is transiting the sun through a conjunction or through an opposition. I know somebody who um, I've been reading their charts and explaining things for many years for, and they've had Chiron. Chiron is now in Aries, so anybody with the sun in Aries would probably they experience a very very long period of Chiron going over their sun, sort of feeling a little bit hollow, feeling a little bit meaningless, and like you you're kind of losing your will to live. And the way this person was describing things, very often it was as if they don't have a right to exist, or they feel like they don't have a right to exist, or they feel like people do not consider them important, or they feel inadequate or worthless in a way. Just as a note, say on the right hand side, so they feel inadequate, worthless, hollow, incomplete, and meaningless. So this is an experience that comes with Chiron. It sounds a lot like Saturn. I think Chiron has something to do. It has quite a bit to do with Saturn. So in the Greek myth, the centaur that is Chiron was actually born through the union of the nymph Philyra with the Titan Kronos, and the Titan Kronos, the father of time, has a lot to do in astrology with Saturn. So there is a connection and affinity between Saturn and Chiron. In the same way as between Lilith and Mars, there's going to be some affinity, which we're going to talk a bit about later. People with a very strong Chiron can feel a lot like misfits and like they don't belong in a certain place. People have Chiron on the ascendant. I did an episode not too long ago about Martin Scorsese, and he said when he went to university that he felt like he didn't really belong there. So he had this feeling of inferiority and like he doesn't belong in a certain place. And he has Chiron very close to the ascendant, so this is very close to who he is. If being invalidated, alienated, and feeling ineffective and just worthless, and these have a lot to do with Chiron experiences. Pluto, I think, can make you feel meaningless and can make you feel really small and worthless, but it's in a very different way. And it's, again, Chiron. Pluto likes to play with your mind a lot. Chiron is more. It just makes you feel rejected by society in a way. And lastly, the last point that I wanted to talk about is the Black Moon Lilith, or you can just call it Lilith. And this chart is at 12 degrees of Scorpio. So this is a really unique point that I think some modern astrologers look at it. I think there is an astrologer in a psychological astrology school that I did, Lynn Bell, that talked about Lilith, and I thought her work on Lilith was really good and really inspiring, and this is what inspired me to always kind of have Lilith at the back of my mind. It's not really in the foreground because it's not one of the most important points in the chart, but it is a point that's really important still to me because it aspects a lot of the planets in my chart, and I think I resonate a lot with a lot of the characteristics of Lilith. So it comes to us through myth as well. So Lilith comes to us through Mesopotamian and Jewish mythology, and it has to do with the refusal to submit, refusal to be dominated or suppressed, demand for absolute equality, transparency, truth, and honesty. It has to do with rebellion against patriarchal order. It is a very feminine influence, a very nocturnal influence. It belongs, I think this is something Dimitra George, who wrote a whole book about the dark moon, she said that Lilith belongs to the world of Pluto in a way. And I think it does have an affinity with Pluto, and it has a bit of an affinity with Mars as well. It is a very dark, nocturnal, and very feminine influence in a way. It has to do with seduction, independence, and female sexuality quite a lot. Feminine power, rage, and refusal. Again, refusal in general, but especially refusal to be dominated or to submit to other people. Complete emptiness and destruction, a sort of rage and revenge. It is sort of like a seductress, and it sort of determines people to accept the loss of physical security and accept, exclusion and seclusion for the sake of getting those ideals that I care about. It has a lot to do with knives, and there is especially a Middle Eastern dance that females perform usually, where they're holding swords or daggers in their hands. And I think that's a really beautiful dance that made me think of Lilith quite immediately. Um, it has to do with this is something that I got from Dimitar George's book. So she said it has to do with the murderous rage felt towards children when we feel tied down and restricted. So, it's a very violent desire to sort of not be tied down and restricted and to be free. So we talked a bit about freedom with Uranus, but this is a very different kind of freedom. It's a very Martian kind of freedom. So maybe a sort of Mars-Uranus conjunction would give some Lilith characteristics. They have an affinity with Lilith characteristics. And it can be associated with abuse against children, miscarriages, and patterns of repeated abortions. So especially women who have planets very close to Lilith, they might have experiences with miscarriages and repeated abortions. I know one example is Beyonce, who has the moon very close to the dark moon Lilith, and I think she had 3 miscarriages or something like that. Nobody knows anything about any abortions, but we do know about miscarriages. Those were quite well documented through her music, and she talked about it quite a few times. So yeah, this is not a point that I think about a lot. If I see it, in the 6th house, for example, I would probably think, if this was a chart of a person, we have Lilith in the 6th house in Scorpio, so we would probably think, I'm wondering if at work, especially being so close to Venus and being so close to the Sun, I would wonder, maybe this person at work has some relationships with people which are ruled by Venus, where they might be involved with a lot of rage or revenge, or they might feel like they're being dominated by other people, and they're trying to rebel, and they're trying to refuse things. Maybe they're demanding a lot of, they don't like lies, they don't like the small talk in the office, the pleasantries that people exchange, and they demand depth, and they demand a little bit more from people in their relationships. So this is something that I would think about. It does paint relationships for this. If this was a person, it would paint relationships for them in a very different color than if Lilith wasn't there. Sometimes Lilith kind of shows up as, especially in women, I noticed that when Venus is with Lilith closely associated, sometimes women they dislike men quite a lot. So this does happen often if Lilith is really prominent in the chart. In the chart of a female, for example, they might not like men very much. So it is a minor point. It adds extra detail to the interpretation of a chart, kind of like Chiron does. But I think it's an important point to sort of keep at the back of your mind. So I think this is going to be the end of the video. It's quite late in the evening now, but I wanted to finish this video today. I think once the planets are understood quite well as symbols, even without knowing anything about the houses or aspects or the signs in astrology, just by following what the planets are doing, following especially what the moon is doing in the chart and what planets it comes into contact with. So for example, in this chart, the moon is making a very close sextile with Mercury and Mars. So, a sextile is quite a good influence. It is that blue line between them. It shows an affinity between them, and maybe having a sort of heated conversation is something that can happen. The moon manifests things, and maybe you have a heated conversation, but it's somewhat friendly because we have a 60-degree angle. So when you put things together, if you have a tendency to follow the astrological chart and to follow what the moon is doing, you can already learn a lot about astrology. So for example, if you're feeling really depressed or really down one day, it's really interesting to look, is the moon very close to Saturn? If the moon is opposite Saturn or in a square with Saturn, or even worse, if it is in a conjunction with Saturn, there's your answer. On that day, you're way more likely to feel depressed or down. So it's really interesting to follow, and I think that's all for today, and I'll see you in the next video.